Ruby Williams, a waitress buried under $95,000 in student debt, accidentally brushed the shoulder of billionaire Gary Morrison while refilling his water. She watched him stiffen, his expression shifting from irritation to outright contempt. But as she apologized and steadied her pitcher, Morrison turned to his business associate and began speaking in rapid, cutting Castilian Spanish. He mocked her, called her una campesina ignorante, and laughed about how these people never even know they're being insulted. He assumed the help was invisible. He assumed she was simple. What he didn't know was that Ruby's $95,000 in debt came from a master's degree in Spanish linguistics and Latin American studies from Georgetown. She set down her water pitcher, straightened her spine, and looked him dead in the eye. The words that came out of her mouth next didn't just stop his heart. They torched his entire world. The order chime on the kitchen tablet rang out, a sound that had become the rhythm of Ruby Williams' slow-motion disaster. It was 6:45 p.m. on a Thursday, and the Wellington, a steakhouse so exclusive it required a 3-month waiting list, was alive with the low hum of power. The air smelled of charred aged beef and quiet entitlement. Ruby, 27, balanced a heavy water pitcher in her right hand, the glass cold against the calluses she'd developed over 18 months of this work. Each bottle of wine on the tables around her cost more than her monthly rent. She was, by every academic standard, brilliant. She held a master's degree in Spanish linguistics and Latin American studies from Georgetown University. She could deconstruct colonial power dynamics in 4 dialects and translate 16th-century poetry with her eyes closed. She'd lived in Madrid, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City for her field research. She was also drowning in $95,000 of student loan debt. This crushing reality was why she was here at the Wellington in downtown Chicago, wearing a crisp white shirt and red apron, smiling at people who looked through her like frosted glass. Williams, Table 12 needs bread. Table 6 wants their steaks redone, again, and the Morrison party just arrived. Do not screw this up. The voice belonged to Nigel Hartwell, the restaurant's general manager. Hartwell was a man who existed in a permanent state of tightly wound anxiety. He ruled through intimidation, bowing to wealthy patrons and crushing the staff beneath them. "The Morrison party?" Ruby asked, ice creeping through her veins. "Gary Morrison, as in Morrison Capital, as in the man who could buy this restaurant, this block, and half the city before his entree arrives. He's in the corner booth, and he expects perfection." Hartwell tugged at his tie, his eyes flicking toward the corner table where a man in an expensive charcoal suit sat with his back to the room. If this story resonated with you, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Ruby moved through the Wellington like a ghost in a starched apron. Table 12 got their breadbasket. Table 6 got their apologies and promises of perfectly medium-rare replacements. And all the while, her mind kept circling back to the same brutal arithmetic that had become her constant companion. 95 and 347 $182. That was the exact number this morning when she'd checked her loan portal for the 100th time, as if staring at it might make it shrink. It never did. The interest alone was $427 a month, which meant every shift she worked, every smile she forced, every "yes, sir," and "right away, ma'am" she delivered, barely made a dent in the beast that was eating her future alive. Have you ever felt your education become your prison? That's what Georgetown had done to Ruby. They'd promised her the world with that master's degree in Spanish linguistics and Latin American studies. Doors had opened all right, just not the ones she'd imagined. Instead of consulting for international firms or working at the State Department, she was here, refilling water glasses for people who earned her yearly salary in a weekend. The cruelest part? She was brilliant at languages, exceptional even. Her thesis on the evolution of Rioplatense Spanish had earned departmental honors. She'd spent 2 years living abroad, immersing herself in the cadence of Madrid's streets, the rhythm of Buenos Aires tango clubs, the warmth of Mexico City markets. She could switch between dialects like changing radio stations, hear the subtle class markers in someone's vowel sounds, translate poetry in ways that preserved not just meaning, but soul. None of that mattered when rent was due. A woman at table 9 snapped her fingers without looking up from her phone. Ruby swallowed the flash of anger and walked over, her face arranged in pleasant neutrality. "How can I help you?" "This wine is corked. Bring another bottle. A different vintage." The woman still hadn't made eye contact. Ruby picked up the glass, sniffed it. The wine was fine. Perfect, actually. But she nodded. Of course, right away. This was the killing part. Not the debt itself, but what it was doing to her. She could feel herself disappearing, her edges blurring, her fire dying. 2 years ago, she would have debated philosophy over cheap beer with classmates until dawn. She would have argued passionately about linguistic colonialism and cultural preservation. Now she bit her tongue 20 times a shift and called it survival. What would you do? Keep your dignity and starve, or swallow your pride and eat? Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Probably her mother, asking if she'd found a real job yet. As if this wasn't real. As if the blisters on her feet and the ache in her lower back weren't real. As if the slow death of her dreams wasn't the most real thing in her life. Hartwell appeared at her elbow, his face tight with that particular anxiety he reserved for VIP arrivals. "The Morrison table, corner booth. They just ordered the Chateau Margaux." He paused, letting the weight settle. "That's the $1,200 bottle." Ruby's stomach dropped. Of course it was. "I'll take care of it." "You'll do more than that. You'll be invisible, efficient, and perfect. Morrison tips well if you don't remind him you exist." Hartwell straightened an already straight napkin on a nearby table, his hands trembling slightly. Gary Morrison owns half of Chicago's commercial real estate. He could buy this restaurant with his watch. So smile, nod, disappear. Understood? Understood. Be furniture. Be wallpaper. Be anything except the person she'd spent 7 years of higher education becoming. Ruby picked up the wine bottle from the bar, feeling its weight. $1,200. More than her monthly loan payment, sitting in a glass bottle that would be empty in an hour. She straightened her apron, checked her reflection in the polished chrome of the kitchen door. The woman staring back looked tired, defeated. Nothing like the confident graduate who'd walked across that stage 3 years ago. Diploma in hand, future bright as summer. Ruby took a breath and headed toward the corner booth, where Gary Morrison sat with his back to the room. Radiating the kind of power that came from never hearing the word no. She had no idea that in exactly 4 minutes she would say something that would destroy everything she'd worked for. And she had even less idea that the man waiting at that table would become the reason her entire life was about to explode. What Morrison didn't know, what nobody in this restaurant knew, was that Ruby Williams understood every word of Spanish ever spoken. Every single word. And he was about to make the most expensive mistake of his billion-dollar life. The corner booth was a study in casual wealth. Gary Morrison sat with his back against the leather banquette, his charcoal suit tailored so precisely it looked like it had been painted on. Across from him sat another man, younger, nervous energy radiating from him like heat. Papers were spread across the table between them, contracts or proposals, the kind of documents that moved millions with a signature. Ruby approached with the wine bottle cradled carefully in her right hand. "Good evening, gentlemen. Your Chateau Margaux." Morrison didn't look up. The other man gave her a brief, distracted nod. She showed Morrison the label as she'd been trained, waited for acknowledgement that never came, then began the careful process of opening the bottle. The cork came out with a soft pop. She poured a small amount into Morrison's glass for tasting, the deep red liquid catching the light like liquid ruby. He swirled it once, sniffed, drank. No comment. She took that as approval and began filling his glass properly. That's when it happened. As she leaned in to pour, the edge of her sleeve brushed against Morrison's shoulder. The lightest touch, barely contact at all. But she felt him stiffen immediately, felt the temperature at the table drop 10 degrees. "I'm so sorry, sir," Ruby said quickly, pulling back the bottle without spilling a drop. "My apologies." Morrison's jaw tightened. He brushed at his shoulder where her sleeve had touched him, as if removing dirt. Then he turned to his companion and began speaking in rapid Spanish, his tone dripping with contempt. "¿Ves lo que tengo que soportar? Una campesina ignorante que ni siquiera puede servir vino sin tocarme. You see what I have to put up with? An ignorant peasant who can't even pour wine without touching me." His associate shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Morrison continued, his voice low but cutting. Clearly confident that the waitress standing 3 feet away couldn't understand a word. "Esta gente. They hire anyone off the street now. Look at her, probably has a high school diploma if we're lucky. No ambition, no education, no future." He picked up his wine glass, examining it with exaggerated care. "They live their pathetic little lives serving people like us, and they don't even realize how invisible they are." Ruby stood perfectly still, her face a professional mask, the wine bottle steady in her hand. Inside, something cold and sharp was crystallizing in her chest. The associate glanced at her, then back at Morrison. "Gary, tal vez deberíamos, maybe we should, no te preocupes, no entiende nada." Morrison waved dismissively. "Don't worry, she doesn't understand anything. These people never do. That's the beauty of it. We can say whatever we want, and they just stand there with their empty smiles." He laughed, the sound bitter and cruel. "Una campesina ignorante sin futuro. An ignorant peasant with no future. That's all she'll ever be." Have you ever been invisible? Not figuratively, but truly unseen, spoken about like your furniture? That's what Morrison believed Ruby to be. Just another face in the background of his gilded life. He had no idea that every word he'd just spoken had landed like a physical blow. No idea that the woman holding his $200 bottle of wine had spent 2 years in Madrid perfecting her Castilian accent. No idea that she'd written her graduate thesis on the exact regional variations he was using so carelessly. No idea that he'd just insulted someone who could dissect his Spanish the way a surgeon dissects tissue, finding every flaw, every tell, every marker of his mediocre language skills. Ruby set down the wine bottle on the table with perfect, controlled precision. She straightened her spine, feeling something shift inside her. The part of her that had been slowly dying over 18 months of invisible servitude suddenly roared back to life. Morrison was still talking, still laughing, still completely unaware that the world as he knew it was about to tilt on its axis. Subscribe if you believe no one deserves to be mocked in a language they supposedly don't understand. Those who think it's fine to insult people behind their linguistic backs probably won't hit that button anyway. Ruby looked him dead in the eye, and then she spoke. What came out of her mouth next would cost her everything she had left. But in that moment, with her dignity hanging by a thread and her future already in ruins, Ruby Williams decided that some things were worth burning down for. "Perdóneme, Señor Morrison," Ruby said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade wrapped in silk. Her Castilian Spanish was flawless, the theta pronunciation crisp and precise. "Pero creo que hay un pequeño error en su gramática." "But I believe there's a small error in your grammar." The effect was instantaneous. Morrison's face went white, then red, then white again. His wine glass froze halfway to his lips. Ruby continued, switching seamlessly to the softer, warmer tones of Mexican Spanish. "Verá, cuando dijo esta gente, usó el artículo incorrecto para el contexto que intentaba transmitir. You see, when you said these people, you used the wrong article for the context you were trying to convey." She tilted her head slightly, her expression professionally pleasant. "A menos que, por supuesto, su intención fuera sonar como un turista estadounidense que aprendió español de una aplicación. Unless, of course, your intention was to sound like an American tourist who learned Spanish from an app." Morrison's associate had gone completely still, his eyes wide. Then Ruby shifted again, this time to the distinctive Rioplatense accent of Buenos Aires, the Y and L sounds becoming the characteristic sh that marked Argentine Spanish. "Y esa frase, campesina ignorante, ¿sabes qué es terminología de la época colonial? Do you know that's colonial-era terminology?" She leaned in slightly, her tone conversational, almost friendly. "Es fascinante que la uses tan casualmente, considerando que implica una mentalidad de hacendado del siglo XIX. It's fascinating that you use it so casually, considering it implies a 19th-century plantation owner mentality." The silence at the table was absolute. Morrison's mouth had fallen open slightly. His brain was clearly trying to catch up with what was happening, and failing spectacularly. "Mi nombre es Ruby Williams," she continued, back in Castilian now, each word precisely articulated. "Tengo una maestría en lingüística española y estudios latinoamericanos de Georgetown University. I have a master's degree in Spanish linguistics and Latin American studies from Georgetown University." She paused, letting that sink in. "Viví 2 años en Madrid, Buenos Aires y Ciudad de México investigando dialectos regionales y la evolución del español en las Américas. I lived 2 years in Madrid, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City researching regional dialects and the evolution of Spanish in the Americas." Morrison tried to speak. Nothing came out. "Así que cuando dice que soy una campesina ignorante sin futuro," Ruby's voice dropped lower, colder. "Lo que realmente me está diciendo es que usted asume que la educación y la inteligencia se correlacionan con la ropa que uno viste o el trabajo que uno hace para sobrevivir. So when you say I'm an ignorant peasant with no future, what you're really telling me is that you assume education and intelligence correlate with the clothes one wears or the job one does to survive." She picked up the wine bottle again, topped off his glass with steady hands. También me dice que su español, aunque funcional, carece de la sofisticación cultural necesaria para una verdadera negociación internacional. It also tells me that your Spanish, while functional, lacks the cultural sophistication necessary for true international negotiation. What would you say if someone spent years mocking you, only to discover you understood every word? How would you use that power? Ruby switched back to English, her voice carrying just far enough for Morrison to hear, but not the tables beyond. The wine you're drinking, by the way, is a 2010 Chateau Margaux. Excellent choice. Robert Parker gave it a 98. It pairs beautifully with humble pie. Morrison's face had gone through several colors and settled on a kind of grayish white. His associate was staring at Ruby like she'd just performed a magic trick. "Is there anything else I can get for you gentlemen this evening?" Ruby asked, her professional waitress voice back in place, as if the last 60 seconds hadn't just happened. Morrison finally found his voice. It came out as a hoarse whisper. How did you... Oh, you mean, how did an ignorant peasant learn to speak Spanish better than you? Ruby's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Student loans, Senor Morrison. $95,000 of them. That's how invisible people afford educations. We go into debt so crushing it forces us to work jobs where men like you can mock us in languages we supposedly don't understand. She set the wine bottle down on the table between them. Disfruten su cena, caballeros. Enjoy your dinner, gentlemen. Ruby turned on her heel, her head high, and walked away from the table with every ounce of dignity she had left. Behind her, she heard Morrison's shaky exhale, heard papers rustling as his associate shifted nervously. She could feel eyes on her back, wondered if anyone else in the restaurant had witnessed what just happened. She made it exactly 12 steps before Hartwell materialized in front of her, his face purple with rage. And Ruby realized that defending your dignity sometimes means watching your entire world catch fire. "My office! Now!" Hartwell's voice was low and venomous, the kind of controlled fury that was somehow worse than shouting. Ruby followed him through the kitchen, past the line cooks, who suddenly found their stations fascinating, past the dishwasher who wouldn't meet her eyes. The office was a cramped room that smelled like old coffee and anxiety. Hartwell shut the door behind them with a click that sounded like a gunshot. "What?" he said, his voice shaking. "Did you just do out there?" Ruby kept her spine straight. "A customer was speaking Spanish. I responded in Spanish. I don't see..." "You don't see?" Hartwell's face was turning that dangerous shade of purple again. "You don't see how embarrassing a platinum-tier client in the middle of his dinner might be a problem? He was insulting me, calling me an ignorant peasant. I don't care if he called you the devil's own daughter." Hartwell slammed his hand on the desk. "Gary Morrison spends $40,000 a year in this restaurant. $40,000. Do you know how much you're worth to me, Williams? Your entire annual wages don't add up to 3 of his dinners." The math was brutal and accurate. Ruby felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're fired! Effective immediately!" Hartwell was already pulling her employee file from the cabinet. "Clean out your locker and leave through the back. I don't want you anywhere near the dining room." "You're firing me for speaking Spanish?" Ruby's voice came out smaller than she intended. "I'm firing you for creating a scene, for embarrassing a valued customer, for insubordination." Hartwell wouldn't look at her as he filled out the termination paperwork. "You knew better. Every server knows better. The customer is always right, Williams. Even when they're wrong, they're right. Especially when they spend $40,000 a year. Is he right? Is that really how the world works? Stay quiet, accept the insult, keep your job, or speak up and lose everything. Ruby thought about arguing. Thought about mentioning that Morrison had violated basic human decency, that his insults were degrading, that she had every right to defend herself. But she could see in Hartwell's eyes that none of it mattered. The arithmetic was simple and savage. Morrison's money versus her dignity. The equation had already been solved. "I need this job," Ruby heard herself say, hating how desperate she sounded. "I have loans, rent. I can't—" "You should have thought about that before you decided to show off your language skills." Hartwell signed the termination form with a vicious scratch of his pen. "Your final check will be mailed. Leave your apron and name tag on the desk." Ruby's hands trembled as she unpinned the name tag from her shirt. The small rectangle of plastic with Ruby printed on it suddenly felt heavy as a tombstone. She folded the red apron carefully, as if taking her time might somehow reverse what was happening. "For what it's worth," Hartwell said, still not looking at her, "you're a good server. But this is the real world, Williams. Pride doesn't pay rent." Ruby walked back through the kitchen in a daze. Her locker took 30 seconds to empty. A change of clothes, her phone charger, a granola bar she'd been saving for the inevitable dinner rush crash. The sum total of her presents at the Wellington fit in a canvas tote bag that had seen better days. She stepped out into the alley behind the restaurant, and the November air hit her like a slap. The door locked behind her with a metallic click. 6:45 on a Thursday evening, and Ruby Williams was unemployed. Her phone showed 3 unread texts from her mother and a banking alert. Rent was due in 5 days. Her student loan payment auto-drafted in 8. She had $1,947 in her checking account and no job. The math was simple and terrifying. Ruby leaned against the cold brick wall and tried to remember how to breathe. Inside the restaurant, through the walls, she could hear the muffled sounds of dinner service continuing without her. The world moved on. It always did. She wondered if Morrison was still sitting at his table, finishing his $1,200 bottle of wine. Wondered if he felt any guilt at all, or if getting a waitress fired was just another Thursday for him. Wondered if that moment of standing up for herself, of refusing to be invisible, had been worth the price she was about to pay. Her dignity felt cold comfort when weighed against homelessness. Ruby pushed off the wall and started walking toward the bus stop. Her canvas bag over her shoulder, her future a blank and terrifying void. She'd defended herself against a billionaire's casual cruelty, and now she was about to find out exactly what that kind of courage cost. Spoiler alert, it costs everything. But what Ruby didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know as she waited for the bus in the freezing November dark, was that sometimes losing everything is the only way to gain what you actually need. And Gary Morrison, sitting in his corner booth, with shame burning in his chest, and her words still ringing in his ears, was about to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. The question was whether Ruby would even answer the phone when he called. Ruby's apartment was a studio in a building that generously described itself as vintage, when it really meant the heat doesn't work half the time. She'd been awake for 18 hours straight, her laptop screen burning her eyes, as she filled out her 23rd job application of the day. Waitress positions, retail, data entry, anything that would hire her before rent came due. Every application felt like a small death, each one a reminder that her Georgetown degree meant nothing when you had a termination on your record from a prestigious restaurant. Her phone had become an instrument of torture. 3 voicemails from her mother, 2 texts from former co-workers asking what happened, 1 email from her loan servicer cheerfully reminding her that her payment would process automatically in 6 days. The number in her checking account had somehow dropped to $1,193 after her phone bill auto-paid. The math was getting worse by the hour. When the knock came at her door at 2 in the afternoon on Friday, Ruby assumed it was her landlord coming early to hassle her about rent. She opened it wearing sweatpants and a Georgetown hoodie that felt like a cruel joke, prepared to beg for a few extra days. Instead, she found a woman in a perfectly tailored navy suit, holding a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of professional courtesy that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ruby Williams?" the woman asked. "Yes?" "My name is Vivian Holt. I'm the executive assistant to Gary Morrison. May I come in?" Ruby's stomach dropped. "If he sent you here to apologize—" "He didn't." Vivian's tone was crisp. "He sent me here to offer you a job." The world tilted slightly. Ruby gripped the doorframe. "I'm sorry, what?" "May I come in?" Vivian repeated. This conversation would be better conducted inside. Ruby stepped back, suddenly hyper-aware of her unmade bed, the stack of dishes in the sink, the general disaster that was her life on display. Vivian walked in without judgment, set her portfolio on the small kitchen table, and got straight to business. "Mr. Morrison has a problem," Vivian said, pulling out a slim folder. "A catastrophic one. He's in the middle of negotiating a $1.8 billion luxury resort deal in Buenos Aires. The project would be the crown jewel of Morrison Capital's Latin American expansion." Ruby crossed her arms. "What does this have to do with me? Everything is falling apart." Vivian opened the folder, revealing what looked like contract drafts and correspondence. "His translators have been making devastating mistakes. Cultural insensitivities that have offended the Vega family, who own the land the resort would be built on. Idioms translated literally that turned respectful proposals into accidental insults. Yesterday's meeting ended with Senora Vega walking out. Despite herself, Ruby felt a flicker of professional curiosity. How bad are the translations? Bad enough that the Vega family is threatening to sell the land to a European consortium instead. Morrison stands to lose not just the deal, but his reputation in Latin American markets. Vivian pulled out another document. He needs someone who actually understands Spanish. Not just the words, but the culture, the nuance, the regional variations. Ruby laughed, the sound bitter. "So he gets me fired, and now he wants to hire me? He wants to offer you $900,000 as a signing bonus." The number hit Ruby like a physical blow. She sat down hard on her second-hand couch. "I'm sorry, did you say $900,000 plus a salary of $250,000 annually as chief translator and cultural consultant for Morrison Capital's Latin American division?" Vivian slid a contract across the table. "He needs you on a plane to Buenos Aires in 48 hours. Ruby's hands were shaking. $900,000. Her entire student debt gone. Rent, not just paid, but irrelevant. Her mother's worried texts silenced forever. The crushing weight that had been suffocating her for 3 years lifted in a single signature. "Why me?" Ruby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you're the only person who's ever made Gary Morrison feel ashamed." Vivian's expression softened slightly. "And because when he reviewed the previous translations this morning with fresh eyes, he realized every mistake you would have caught immediately." The man is desperate, Ms. Williams. His ego took a hit, but his business is about to take a bigger one. Have you ever had a chance to make someone who wronged you actually pay for it? Not with revenge, but with your value finally being recognized? Ruby stared at the contract. The numbers swam before her eyes. This was everything she'd ever wanted. Validation, financial security. A chance to actually use her education for what it was meant for. But it came from the man who'd called her an ignorant peasant less than 24 hours ago. There are conditions, Ruby said slowly. Vivian pulled out a pen. Mr. Morrison expected there would be. What do you need? And Ruby Williams, who 18 hours ago had been filling out applications for retail positions, began negotiating the deal that would change her life. Ruby's conditions were simple and non-negotiable. A written contract with termination protections. An email from Morrison personally apologizing for his comments at the restaurant. And complete authority over all Spanish-language communications. No questions asked. No overrides allowed. Vivian made one phone call. 15 minutes later, Ruby had all three. The apology email was brief and appeared to cause Morrison physical pain to write, but it existed. Ruby read it twice, saved it to 3 different folders, then signed the contract. Her hand trembled as she wrote her name, $900,000. The wire transfer would hit her account within 24 hours. She didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. Just kept refreshing her banking app like it might make the money appear faster. Morrison's office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the Loop, all floor-to-ceiling windows and aggressive minimalism. Ruby arrived at 9 a.m. Saturday morning wearing the one professional outfit she owned, a gray suit she'd bought for graduate school interviews that was slightly too big now. Morrison was already there, sitting behind a desk made of some dark wood that probably cost more than Ruby's annual salary used to be. He stood when she entered, and the movement was awkward, uncertain. Good. Let him be uncomfortable. Ms. Williams. His voice was formal, distant. Thank you for coming. Mr. Morrison. Ruby matched his tone. I understand we have a disaster to review. He gestured to a conference table where folders were spread out like casualties of war. These are the previous translations and correspondence from the past 6 months of negotiations with the Vega family. Ruby sat down and opened the first folder. Within 30 seconds, her professional horror began. Within 2 minutes, she understood why the deal was collapsing. Within 5 minutes, she wanted to throw something. Oh my God, she breathed, reading a letter that was supposed to be a respectful proposal. They translated Estamos ansiosos por trabajar con su familia as we are anxious about working with your family. She looked up at Morrison. That completely changes the meaning. It sounds like you're worried about them, not eager to partner. Morrison's jaw tightened. The translator said it was correct. The words are technically correct. The meaning is catastrophically wrong. Ruby flipped to another page and winced. Here, they used conquistar el mercado argentino, conquer the Argentine market. Do you have any idea how that sounds to a family whose land was stolen during colonization? I was told it meant to capture market share. It does. It also carries the exact same historical weight as telling Native Americans you want to conquer their territory. Ruby's voice was rising. She forced herself to breathe. Who were these translators? A firm that came highly recommended. They work with Fortune 500 companies. Ruby held up another document. They addressed Senora Vega using tú instead of usted. That's the informal you. In Argentine business culture, especially with someone of her generation and status. That's incredibly disrespectful. It's like calling her by her first name at a board meeting. Morrison had gone pale. We paid them $40,000. You paid them $40,000 to destroy your deal. Ruby kept reading, her horror mounting. They used peninsular Spanish throughout. That's the Spanish spoken in Spain. To Argentines, this sounds colonial and condescending, like you couldn't be bothered to learn their actual language. Would you trust someone who claimed to speak your language but got every cultural nuance wrong? The Vega family didn't, and now Ruby understood why. She found the final insult in a proposal from 3 weeks ago. They translated "Nos encantaría ser socios" as "we would be enchanted to be partners." Enchanted, like it's a fairy tale. The correct translation conveys genuine business interest, not patronizing charm. Morrison sat down heavily. The meeting where Señora Vega walked out. What happened? Ruby found the correspondence, and her stomach sank. Your translator told her that Morrison Capital wanted to bring sophistication to Argentine hospitality. The implication being that Argentine hospitality currently lacks sophistication. That's not what I meant. But it's what you said. Ruby closed the folders and looked directly at Morrison. Every single one of these communications told the Vega family that you see them as unsophisticated colonials who should be grateful for your American money and expertise. You've spent 6 months accidentally insulting them in their own language. The silence in the office was crushing. Can it be fixed? Morrison's voice was quiet. Ruby considered lying, considered walking away from this disaster with her signing bonus and leaving him to burn. But her integrity wouldn't let her. Maybe, but we start over from zero. Complete reset. What do we need? A formal apology, in perfect Rioplatense Spanish, acknowledging the translation failures and your genuine respect for their family and their culture. Ruby leaned forward. And then you let me rebuild this relationship word by word, meeting by meeting, with zero interference. Morrison nodded slowly. When do we leave for Buenos Aires? We don't. Not yet. First, I need to write an apology so good it makes Señora Vega willing to take one more meeting. Ruby pulled out her laptop. And Mr. Morrison, when we do go to Buenos Aires, you don't speak unless I tell you to. Understood? Subscribe if you think expertise and education should actually matter in this world. If you're fine with incompetence getting rewarded while talent goes unrecognized, well, this story probably isn't for you. For the first time in his life, Gary Morrison said the words he'd never had to say before. Yes, ma'am. The flight to Buenos Aires took 11 hours. Morrison spent most of it reviewing financials. Ruby spent it rehearsing every possible variation of formal Argentine Spanish she might need, running through scenarios in her mind like a chess player thinking 12 moves ahead. They landed at Ezeiza International on a Tuesday morning, the Southern Hemisphere spring making everything bright and warm. Morrison had booked them into the Alvear Palace, the kind of hotel where the doormen wore white gloves and remembered your name after one visit. The meeting with the Vega family was scheduled for 7 p.m. at their estancia, an hour outside the city. Ruby used the afternoon to drill Morrison on exactly 3 phrases he was allowed to say. Buenas tardes, muchas gracias, and es un honor. Good afternoon, thank you very much, and it's an honor, nothing else. She made him practice until the pronunciation was acceptable, if not perfect. What if they ask me a direct question? Morrison asked as their car wound through the pampas toward the Vega estate. Then you smile, and I translate their question and your answer. You do not attempt to respond in Spanish. Your last translators did enough damage with bad Spanish. I won't let you add to it. The Vega estancia was stunning. A sprawling ranch house surrounded by centuries-old oak trees and horses grazing in pastures that seemed to stretch forever. This wasn't new money trying to impress. This was old wealth. The kind that had survived dictatorships and economic collapses and came out stronger. Señora Lucia Vega met them at the door. She was in her late 60s, elegant in a way that suggested she'd never had to think about elegance. It simply was. Her husband, Rodrigo, stood beside her, his expression carefully neutral. Their son, Mateo, lurked in the background, arms crossed, radiating skepticism. Ruby stepped forward before Morrison could speak. Buenas tardes, Señora Vega, Señor Vega. Es un verdadero honor estar en su hogar. Gracias por darnos esta oportunidad. Good evening, Mrs. Vega, Mr. Vega. It's a true honor to be in your home. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. Her Rio Platense Spanish was perfect. The sheesh sound in place of the y, the voceo form instead of tu, every detail calibrated for maximum respect. Señora Vega's eyebrows rose slightly. Your Spanish is very good. Viví 2 años en Buenos Aires, investigando dialectos regionales. I lived 2 years in Buenos Aires, researching regional dialects. Ruby smiled warmly. Prefiero dejar que el señor Morrison hable en inglés mientras yo traduzco, para asegurar que no haya más malentendidos. I prefer to let Mr. Morrison speak in English while I translate, to ensure there are no more misunderstandings. More misunderstandings? Mateo's voice was sharp. This was it, the moment Ruby had been preparing for. See, more misunderstandings, because everything you've received from Morrison Capital for the past 6 months has been translated by people who didn't understand Argentine Spanish, your culture, or your family's legacy. The Vegas exchanged glances. Señora Vega gestured toward a sitting room. Please, explain. They settled into chairs that looked like they'd hosted generations of important conversations. Ruby didn't wait for Morrison's cue. She launched directly into the apology she'd crafted, speaking only to the Vegas. Señora, the previous translators were incompetent. They used peninsular Spanish that made Mr. Morrison sound colonial. They used informal address that made him sound disrespectful. They translated business enthusiasm as conquest, partnership as patronization. Ruby leaned forward, her voice sincere. Every word you received made it sound like Mr. Morrison saw your family as unsophisticated. The opposite is true. Is it? Señora Vega's tone was cool. Ruby turned to Morrison. Tell them about your grandmother. Morrison blinked, caught off guard. They'd discussed the business strategy, the financial terms, the resort plans. They had not discussed his grandmother. But Ruby had done her research on the plane, had found the obituary from 15 years ago, had pieced together what Morrison had spent his whole life hiding. Morrison's jaw worked. Then, quietly, he began to speak, and Ruby translated. My grandmother was Maria Guadalupe Morrison, née Reyes. She immigrated from Guadalajara to Chicago in 1959 with nothing but a third-grade education and a determination to give her children better lives. Ruby's translation was flawless, but she added warmth. Morrison's flat English didn't quite convey. She cleaned houses, worked in factories, saved every penny so my father could go to college. Señora Vega's expression shifted slightly. I spent my whole career being ashamed of that, Morrison continued, and Ruby could hear the catch in his voice. I buried her story, changed details, spoke only English in public, built an empire while pretending my grandmother didn't exist. He looked directly at Senora Vega. When I came to Argentina, I thought I was bringing American sophistication to your country. I was wrong. I should have been honoring the kind of legacy your family represents, the kind my grandmother built. Would you forgive someone who finally understood what they'd done wrong? Senora Vega was considering it. Ruby let the silence sit for a moment, then spoke again in Spanish. We're not here to conquer anything, Senora. We're here to ask if your family's legacy and Mr. Morrison's resources could build something together. Something that honors Argentine culture, not exploits it. Senora Vega studied Ruby for a long moment. Then, finally, she smiled, just slightly. Tell me, Senorita, what exactly did you have in mind? And Ruby Williams, who 5 days ago had been unemployed and desperate, began to negotiate a $1.8 billion deal. The negotiation stretched across 3 days of meetings, mate drinking, and careful relationship building. By Thursday evening, they'd made real progress. The Vega family was cautiously optimistic. Morrison had kept his mouth shut and let Ruby work. Everything was moving in the right direction. Then Carlos Mendoza showed up to dinner. He was introduced as a consultant the Vega family had brought in, an expert in international business law and translation. Mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of confident smile that set off alarm bells in Ruby's head. He spoke Spanish with a generic Latin American accent that was hard to place, which itself was suspicious. Most native speakers had clear regional markers. The dinner was at a private restaurant in Palermo, all exposed brick and candlelight. The Vegas, Morrison, Ruby, and now Mendoza, seated around a table where the final contract terms were being discussed. I've reviewed the proposal, Mendoza said in Spanish, sliding a revised document across the table. Just a few small clarifications to protect the Vega family's interests. Ruby scanned the document, her linguist's eye catching details others might miss. Most of it was standard, but buried in Section 7, Paragraph 3, was a phrase that made her pulse quicken. Socio preferido local con derechos de participación minoritaria. Preferred local partner with minority participation rights. Mendoza was translating for Morrison in English, his voice smooth. This clause simply ensures symbolic local presence in the resort's management structure. A gesture of good faith to the community. Ruby's mind raced. The Spanish didn't say symbolic anywhere. Derechos de participación minoritaria meant minority ownership rights, actual equity. And if Mendoza was presenting himself as the local partner, he was writing himself a 15% stake in a $1.8 billion deal. That was $270 million he was trying to steal with a mistranslation. Ruby set down her wine glass carefully. Senor Mendoza, that's a fascinating interpretation. Mendoza's smile didn't waver. I've worked on deals like this for 20 years. It's standard practice. Is it? Ruby switched to Spanish, addressing the Vegas directly. Because derechos de participación minoritaria doesn't mean symbolic presence. It means actual ownership stake, 15%, according to this clause. Mateo Vega frowned, reaching for the document. Let me see that. Mendoza's smile tightened. Senorita Williams, I think you're misreading the legal terminology. I don't think I am. Ruby kept her voice pleasant. In fact, I'm curious about your expertise, Senor Mendoza. You mentioned 20 years in translation and international law. That's correct. Then you'd be familiar with Garcia Marquez, certainly, Every serious Spanish translator knows his work. Ruby pulled out her phone, found the passage she was looking for. Cien años de soledad, one of the most famous opening lines in Latin American literature. Would you mind translating it to English for us? Just to calibrate our understanding of translation accuracy. The table went quiet. Señora Vega's eyes sharpened with interest. Mendoza's smile had frozen on his face. I don't see how literary translation is relevant to legal documents. Humor me, Ruby said. She read aloud. Muchos años después, frente al pelotón de fusilamiento, el coronel Aureliano Buendía había de recordar aquella tarde remota en que su padre lo llevó a conocer el hielo. It was one of the most famous sentences in Spanish literature. Any legitimate translator would know it by heart. Ruby had memorized it her first year of graduate school. Mendoza cleared his throat. Many years later, in front of the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendía remembered that distant afternoon when his father showed him the ice. Ruby's expression didn't change. Close. But había de recordar is future conditional, not simple past. Was to remember, not remembered. It changes the temporal perspective of the entire narrative. Any literature student would know that. A minor distinction. Try this one. Ruby didn't let him finish. She quoted another passage, more complex, filled with the nested temporal layers Marquez was famous for. Mendoza stumbled. His translation was clumsy, missing the subjunctive entirely, flattening the meaning. Interesante, Ruby said softly. Interesting. She turned to Señora Vega. A man who's worked in Spanish translation for 20 years should be able to handle basic literary translation. Unless, of course, his expertise isn't actually in Spanish at all. What would you do if you caught someone trying to steal hundreds of millions of dollars with nothing but smooth words and a fake smile? Señor Vega took the contract from his son's hands, reading the clause carefully. His face darkened. Carlos, what is this? It's a standard provision. It's a provision that gives you 15% ownership of our family's land development. Vega's voice was ice. While telling Senor Morrison it means nothing. Mendoza's smooth facade cracked. I think there's been a misunderstanding. The only misunderstanding, Ruby interrupted, is that you thought you could run this con on people who actually speak Spanish. She pulled up her phone again. I took the liberty of checking your credentials. Your law degree is from a correspondence school. Your previous consulting work involved 2 lawsuits for fraud, and your Spanish, while functional, has the markers of someone who learned it as an adult, not a native speaker. Mendoza stood abruptly, his chair scraping. I don't have to listen to these accusations. Siéntate. Señora Vega's voice cracked like a whip. Sit down. You came into my home, ate at my table, and tried to steal from my family using my own language. She turned to her husband. Rodrigo, show Señor Mendoza out. Make sure the gate security knows he's never to return. Mendoza tried to protest, but Mateo was already standing, his hand on Mendoza's arm, his expression making it clear this wasn't a request. As Mendoza was escorted out, Señora Vega turned to Ruby. Her expression was unreadable. Then, slowly, she smiled. You've saved my family from a very expensive mistake, Señorita Williams. Just doing my job, Señora. No. Señora Vega shook her head. You did much more than that. You proved that Morrison Capital sent us someone who actually gives a damn about getting things right. She picked up the contract, struck through Section 7 entirely. Now, let's discuss the real terms of this partnership. And Ruby realized that sometimes the best negotiation tactic is simply being better at your job than everyone else in the room. After Mendoza's humiliating exit, The negotiation took on a different quality. The Vegas weren't just considering a business deal anymore. They were building a partnership with people they could trust. Ruby spent the next 2 hours meticulously translating every clause, every provision, every single word, until both parties understood exactly what they were agreeing to. At midnight, Senora Vega signed the contract. Her husband signed. Morrison signed. And $1.8 billion worth of Argentine land and American capital officially became partners. "To new beginnings," Senor Vega said, raising his glass of Malbec. "A los nuevos comienzos," Ruby translated, and everyone drank. The flight back to Chicago felt surreal. Morrison sat across from Ruby in the private jet's cabin, looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Which, in a way, he was. "You saved that deal," he said finally. "I did my job." "No," Morrison shook his head. "You did more than that. You caught a fraud I would have missed. You negotiated terms that protected both parties. You built trust with a family that had every reason to walk away." He paused. "You did in 1 week what I couldn't do in 6 months." Ruby sipped her water, too tired for false modesty. "That's because I actually speak Spanish, Mr. Morrison, and I care about getting it right." "Gary," he said quietly, "after everything, I think we can drop the formalities." The silence stretched between them, comfortable in a way Ruby hadn't expected. Finally, Morrison spoke again. "I need to tell you something about my grandmother. About Maria." His voice was rough. "I spent 40 years being ashamed of her. She spoke broken English her whole life, worked jobs I considered beneath me. When I started Morrison Capital, I made sure no one knew about her. Changed the narrative, said my family was established Chicago business." Ruby waited. "When she died, I gave her a small funeral. Didn't announce it publicly. One of my business partners asked why I was taking time off, and I said it was for a family matter. I didn't even say her name." Morrison's hands clenched. "The woman who sacrificed everything so I could have opportunities. And I erased her from my story. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you remind me of her." Morrison looked directly at Ruby. "Not the circumstances, but the refusal to be invisible. She never apologized for who she was, even when people looked down on her. Even when I could." His voice cracked slightly. "And when you stood up to me at that restaurant, speaking her language better than I ever learned it, I realized I'd become the kind of man who would have looked through her like furniture. Would you forgive someone who finally understood the weight of their cruelty?" Ruby was still deciding. "I want to offer you a partnership," Morrison said. "Not just a job. Full partnership. You'd run the new Latin American expansion division, 20% equity, complete authority over all Spanish-language markets, and cultural strategy." Ruby's breath caught. 20% of a division that could be worth billions. "Why?" "Because I'm smart enough to know I need people who are better than me at things I don't understand. And because you've earned it." Morrison pulled out a folder. "I had the lawyers draft the papers. Take your time reviewing them." Ruby opened the folder, scanning the terms. It was generous, shockingly so. But there was something missing. "I have a condition," she said. Morrison nodded. "I expected you would. The Maria Guadalupe Morrison Scholarship for first-generation language students." Ruby looked up from the papers. "Full tuition, living expenses, study abroad funding. Everything I couldn't afford without going into debt that almost destroyed me. We fund 10 students a year, and we name it after your grandmother, publicly, with her full story told honestly. Morrison's eyes went glassy. He cleared his throat. You want me to publicly acknowledge? I want you to honor the woman who made your success possible. And I want to make sure other students who come from where she came from, where I came from, don't have to choose between education and survival. The silence stretched. Morrison stared out the window at the clouds below, his jaw working. 20 students a year, he said finally. And we establish it in Buenos Aires too. Partner with Argentine universities. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Ruby felt something tight in her chest release. Deal. Morrison extended his hand. Ruby shook it. The grip was firm, equal, nothing like the dismissive billionaire who'd called her an ignorant peasant 8 days ago. There's one more thing, Ruby said. The scholarship announcement. I want you to write it, in Spanish. I'll help you, but the words need to come from you. Morrison smiled, the expression tentative but genuine. My Spanish is terrible. I know, but your grandmother's grandson should at least try. Ruby pulled out her laptop. Come on, let's get started. En honor a mi abuela, Maria Guadalupe Morrison, and Gary Morrison, billionaire, CEO, man who'd spent his whole life running from his roots, began learning the language his grandmother had spoken. It was halting, clumsy, filled with errors Ruby patiently corrected. But for the first time in his life, he was trying to speak words that mattered. 3 months later, Ruby stood in front of a crowd at the scholarship announcement, wearing a suit that actually fit, her student loans a distant memory. The first Maria Morrison scholars sat in the front row, 10 students from Chicago and 10 from Buenos Aires, their futures bright and debt-free. Morrison gave his speech in Spanish. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And when he said his grandmother's name with pride instead of shame, Ruby saw tears in the audience. She thought about that night at the Wellington, about the moment she'd chosen dignity over safety, about how sometimes burning down your old life is the only way to build the one you actually deserve. Subscribe if you believe standing up for yourself is worth the risk, even when it costs you everything. Those who'd rather stay silent and invisible, they already know they won't. Her phone buzzed. A message from Senora Vega. Saw the announcement. Your abuela would be proud. Both of them. Ruby smiled and slipped the phone back in her pocket. She had work to do. A division to run. Students to mentor. A future that finally matched the one she'd been promised when she first fell in love with languages. And it all started with refusing to be invisible. Would you take the same risk if you could do it over? Ruby would, every single time.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.